And those sites out there, we think about, we're having wide swings in temperature, which is one of the parts of that VPD. And this is a very interesting graph. Think about it here. What they did in this study is they actually looked at a forested site, a deciduous site, and they looked at temperature swings in that site versus out in an open area. And so everything was zeroed to this line here. So this is underneath the forest canopy. And what we have here is leaf development here, happened here. Leaf drop happened here due to the season. And what it shows is, in comparison to underneath that canopy, that open site had wider swings in temperature above that line during the day, the maximum temperatures, and had better potential or higher potential for lower temperatures, frost events. And this is talking about at 1 meter above the ground. What happens if we go down to the soil surface? Here's some work I did at one point where you can see this is what happens during the day around that seedling out there. During the day, that temperature on this site got to around 18 degrees C. And this is we're talking about at 1 meter up. But here, what we're finding is they start the day, it warms up, and we can get temperatures around those seedling very easily in the 20s and 30s. And on this study, we actually looked at one where we had a slight vegetation cover, and I didn't put it on here, where we didn't have that wind moving across to blow that away. I had soil temperatures that were running 50 to 60 degrees. So here's a tree during the nighttime is getting exposed to temperatures of 5 to 8 degrees C. And around its root collar in the middle of the day, it's getting 50 to 60 degrees C. And then going back the next night to be back around 8 to 10. And I wonder when I go out there and go, why in the hell isn't this tree growing? If I was exposed to that kind of swings all day long, I might not be able to grow either. And here's an example of taking that kind of information on temperature shifts and looking at it in relation to VPD throughout the day on an open site versus a closed site. Here's VPD throughout the day, or vapor pressure deficit, throughout the day on a closed site. Here's the kind of conditions you can get diurnally on an open site. And what we did is we looked at it and said, okay, how many times does a plant on average be exposed to maximum type of conditions? And this is a boreal site. And what we found is that 40% of the time these plants are exposed to VPDs greater than 2 kilopascals. 40% of the time it's between 1 and 2, and then about 25% of the time or so less than 1. Well, what does that mean? This is how a well-watered seedling on a reforestation site responds to VPD. Its base water potentials or pre-dawn water potentials telling you how much of the soil were very, very high. In other words, it had access to all the water it wanted. As VPD goes up, that plant undergoes water stress. Well, what does that mean? Here's how that plant was responding, its photosynthetic response to VPD. We exceed 1.5 kilopascals of VPD, we're cutting photosynthetic capability by in half. And this is happening literally seconds. These plants are responding like this all the time out there. You and I look at them and they just look like they're sitting there. They're responding to these conditions all the time, and as the weather shifts out there. So I think what we have to recognize is we start opening up those sites, we're going to have wider strings in temperatures and vapor pressure deficits. And on open sites, 40% of the time you're going to have conditions that could cause evaporative stress on that plant at some point in time. And that's going to cause, potential to cause water stress and a reduction in photosynthesis. Now there are very few actually studies out there in the literature where somebody has now grown a plant consistently at the high VPD versus a low VPD. But the studies I have seen show that, not surprisingly, you could put another line down here and saying if they're under high VPD all the time, guess what? They're going to grow a lot slower. And they do. So let's look at the shift again to another short story. Let's look at soil water. Well, when you have a canopy on that site, like I said, it kind of protects that site, but it also, and I found this very interesting when I found this, is that 20-25% of the water that's coming in the way of rain gets hung up in that canopy and evaporates back out. So not surprisingly, in certain situations, when they do a clear cut, when you have it, believe it or not, when you first do a clear cut, and there's no vegetation on that site, it's actually going to have higher levels of soil water than a forest nearby. However, we all know Those clear cuts or open forests do not stay that way for very long. Nature hates a vacuum, and it very quickly fills that up. And if you now start bringing competition into that situation, all of a sudden that competition is now going to start taking that water and utilizing it. And what does that mean to a plant? Well, here is the photosynthetic response of conifers to what they call pre-dawn water potential. What's pre-dawn water potential? It's measured, unfortunately, at about 4 in the morning. And it's where the plant finally has come into balance with what available soil water is there for it. And what you see is you increase or decrease the pre-dawn water potential. In other words, the soil gets drier, the photosynthetic response declines. To the point that you get out here at a certain level of stress, if everything else is still optimum, that plant's shut down completely. It's not even photosynthesizing at all. So what happens when you put these plants under stress on a regular basis? This is one of these interesting things I was telling you. This is a duration, not an intensity study. We did a study where we put plants out in a field where either there was competition, and we're talking about competition being grass competition, so there was no above competition for the shoots of these plants in comparison to an area where we got rid of all the vegetation. So we just have something competing for that soil moisture in that system. And it was very interesting. I went out there and we had guys out, we were measuring twice every week for about 18 weeks straight. And I would say maybe only on 2 of those days were I able to say the competition was causing water stress in these plants and causing the stomates to close. This is called a stomatal optimization. It's just it's those pores underneath opening and closing, and when those close down, they don't photosynthesize. But when I added up the cumulative stress that those plants were under for that growing season, that vegetation took away enough moisture to cause enough stress on those plants that accumulated over time. And as a result, at the end of the year, we had reduced incremental shoot growth and reduced shoot and root biomass. So here's a little stress occurring every day on that plant. Finally ends up as a cumulative effect. These are just kind of those motherhood statements. Site conditions, stand structure affects soil water availability. Physiological process decrease with that stress. Subsequent morphological things that you see out there finally at the end of the year could be a result of this. So now let's look at another story. Let's look at another edaphic factor. Let's look at soil temperature. Here's a classic curve of soil temperatures on the boreal site that you people probably walk across on a regular basis. And what you can see, not surprising, you get your highest soil temperatures in the middle, but you don't really have very high soil temperatures that often. Growing season is very narrow, and we were talking earlier about tomatoes and the fact that they can't handle cold temperatures. Well, you have very narrow window where these plants have an ability to grow under optimum conditions. You take this and look at an open site versus a closed forest site, you can see the cumulative effect of soil temperature of that canopy keeping that sun and that thermal energy up at the top and not letting it down to where it can hit the soil. It accumulates over that season, and almost consistently every week you're finding that open site is going to have more and higher soil temperatures. What does this mean to a plant? Here's a curve showing how those plants respond to having their feet cold. You drop below 10 degrees C, they start slowing their photosynthetic process down. It's not really just the photosynthesis. It actually, believe it or not, this is probably related to the fact that as it gets colder, people don't realize that water gets thicker before it freezes, and where those roots, where the water absorbs that root, all of a sudden gets slushier, and it makes it harder for water to move through. And so, believe it or not, you can actually have water stress. I've actually aerated plants at 1 degree C and created water stress, because that plant can't move water across those membranes into its root system. And so when it's cold, their physiological processes start shutting down. Not surprisingly, you keep their feet cold or their roots cold, they're going to grow less. And what I find interesting about this study is that they did this study those cool plants were exposed to 13 degrees C versus 20 degrees C for the other ones. So even here, where I'm not even picking it up with a physiological response, those plants are picking it up and having an effect of just that shift. What does that mean when we do something? Well, we turn around, if we have vegetation on that site, this is a study where they essentially just looked at the accumulation of growing degree day temperatures over a season for different silvicultural treatments. And what they found is we have vegetation on that site, it's keeping that thermal energy up here, those soils are going to stay cold. We get rid of that vegetation layer, but we keep that organic layer. We increase it some, but not completely. We turn around and get rid of that organic layer. We now increase the temperatures again. And now if I take that soil and mound it, which I put it above that, we even get more temperatures. I'm not saying we do that, but I'm saying this is what you can do for soil temperature, if this is a variable that is your most limiting factor. Vegetation reduces soil temperatures. All that thermal energy gets hung up in the canopy. If temperatures below 10 degrees C, physiological processes start shutting down. Those low soil temperatures limit growth. And we can do silvicultural practices, just like the example I showed, to manipulate that if that's what we need to do. Chuck Rhodes talked about this morning, and he probably did a better job than I on describing what's going on these sites. But he talked about the cycle that's going on out there, and he's talking about nitrogen, and this is essentially what he was talking about going on. There's a cycle going on there where nutrients are either being held up in the plant, or being held up in the organic layer, or being turned over in that system all the time. We're not going to go into detail about that, but it's happening on a regular basis. And here's just an example showing we've got a lot of nitrogen hung up in that forest humus layer in comparison to the mineral soil. So on the last bit I was talking about soil temperature, saying, hey, if you blade it, you bring the temperature up. Here I'm saying, well, guess where all your nitrogen is? It's in that humus layer. And as he was mentioning, talking about how in these stands that open up, all of a sudden he's got more nitrogen in them. That's what they found out in this study too. They looked at a open clear-cut site versus a boreal forest. They found as soon as they opened that up, within a year, all of a sudden we've got all kinds of nitrate nitrogen in there that's happened that wasn't there before. And all of a sudden I've got all kinds of nitrogen available in that system that can be used by the vegetation, both the competition and the trees we want. And you and I can see that out there. It's one of the things we can detect, is we can actually see by looking at the color of the plants, if they're getting greener out there, there's a direct correlation between those plants getting greener and the nitrogen concentration. In fact, we actually use this at Cell4 as one of my quality control tools. I used to have my crew wander around out to the nurseries. If they had issues, they actually had little color cards. They had little numbers across the bottom. They walk around and tell me it's a number 4. Or it's a number 2. I got a problem when I got to number 2, but when I was at number 5 or 6, I got a nice green plant. We're okay. Reason being, when nitrogen concentration goes up, plants like to photosynthesize more. This is an interesting study where they looked at doing a site prep, and then 4 years later asked the question, where is all that, where the nutrients went? And so they did a study where they looked at the nutrient content of the shoots 4 years after they did a treatment. And what they found had happened is if we did a vegetation control or some kind of site prep, vegetation control, all of a sudden my plants had a lot more nitrogen in them. We opened up that system, we got the process going, they were able to take up more nitrogen. Not surprisingly, they looked at shoot biomass, and guess what? Treatments that opened up and gave them more nitrogen had better growth. What I found interesting in this study, when they looked at this, they had no changes in phosphorus and potassium in this system. Nitrogen was the main macronutrient that sped up and became part of that and was available now for plants. Forest sites store a lot of nutrients. It was talked about a lot this morning. You open up those stands, Mountain Pine Beetle, whatever, all of a sudden those nutrients now become available in that system. And plants, both the competition and our crop, are going to respond positively to that. And we have the ability through different silvicultural practices to possibly shape that and push it in directions we want, if we know this is our limiting factor. So I've given you a series of examples where they're responding to one variable. Well, guess what? Unfortunately, plants out there aren't responding to one thing out there on the site at any one time. And here's an example of them responding to two variables. This is photosynthesis in response to light and evaporative demand. And so we modeled their response when we kept all the edaphic conditions nice and optimum. And you can see that yes, improved light is great, but the problem is and a lot of times what happens is if you actually look at data out there, I would say 80% of your data tends to lay across this area of the curve, which is showing, yeah, when I get improved light, I'm going to get improved photosynthesis, but guess what? VPD goes up too. Because now I've got more thermal energy, which is more heat in that system, which means my evaporative demand goes up. So even though I got more light, I've got a pull down in that system because I've now got higher VPDs. What if I throw an edaphic response on top of an atmospheric response? Here's a site where we put these trees. What's neat about this is this was clonal material, spruce clonal material from a tissue culture program. So this is the exact same clones in two different locations. An optimum site and a forest site where we had moisture there. What we didn't have is we didn't have soil temperature. We probably had some of those temperatures I was telling you about. We're probably down in that 10-8 degree range. Look at the difference between these two. There's a multiple things going on here. What happens if I also throw a frost on top of that? What if I throw a nutrient stress? This is where all of a sudden you're standing out there looking at this tree out there and going, well, why isn't it growing? You know, the question is, what variable have we done? And what variable is limiting out there that's causing this? And then we as humans do this. We throw all our silviculture and management practices on top of that. And actually have it now going through a dynamic, and we were talking about that was the Mountain Pine Beetle stands. We've got stands in all kinds of areas. We're planting seedlings. We're dealing with stuff that's in an establishment phase. We're dealing with stuff that's in transition, where we've got all kinds of structure out there on that site. We've got different species we're thinking about, and we're out there applying all kinds of silvicultural practices. And we're wondering sometimes why isn't it growing the way I thought it was? This is the interesting thing, is to try to tease out what are those factors and what are the things that are causing those limitations and not. And so it's a complex system you have out there you're working with. I wasn't intended just to give you the answers, unfortunately, because each of these situations is different. What I think I want to leave the message with you is that you need to be aware of this. And don't be surprised sometimes when the plan you have works, but sometimes the plan you have doesn't work. And the reason it isn't working is somewhere in this system out here, something is causing a limitation. The trick is to find out what. What are your variables that are causing your major limitations? And what can I do as a way of a silvicultural practice to mitigate those as much as I can to get the performance I want? So I'll leave you with a couple of just closing thoughts. These mountain pine beetle sites are going to create a wide array of environmental conditions. Probably more so than you've ever had to deal with before. In certain ways, and I don't know if it really can say that, but clear cuts were easy in comparison. I had it coming from one direction at least. Now you can have it coming from multiple directions. And plants are going to be responding to all those. Trees are very responsive. You and I can't see it, but it's literally happening every second that plant's out there. It's one of the neat things we had. We had all kinds of equipment we could clamp onto these plants and watch them, and it was just amazing to watch. It's literally through the day. They're just doing this. They're like a kid on speed. They're just moving around all the time. We can't see it. All we see is the final end point, and then we wonder how it got there. Well, it's responding. We just can't, with our normal way we perceive things, see it. So that's what this equipment allowed us to do. But it's really quite amazing. Silvicultural practices we have are going to have an influence on that. We have to know that it's going to work. We're going to affect that environment. We're going to manipulate that environment in different ways. And it's going to create certain kinds of physiological responses, and subsequently we're going to see that in how those plants perform. Unfortunately, sometimes you're going to do that practice here, it's going to respond, and you're going to see the performance out here. This is why, if you have some of this knowledge, and I'm not saying you have to be completely versed in this, but if you have some of this knowledge of how these plants go from point A to point B, you don't have to wait till that plant gets to point B to make your decisions. You can think about it, and if you know how the plants respond, you can then say, okay, maybe I can manipulate these variables here to create this kind of set of conditions, which then allow me to get, instead of this response, I get this response. That's the power of ecophysiology and what it can do. And I'll just leave you, if I was only able to talk just briefly about some of this. I was very fortunate a number of years ago when I put this book together. I was doing a series of workshops for a series of forest companies in the Prince George area for about 3 or 4 years. And their chief forester came to me and said, Steve, can you write all this stuff down? Because nobody can remember it all. And so this was a project I got paid for by a series of forest companies. And that forester gave me that comment. And I told it earlier to Keith, and I think I mentioned to you. He wanted, at the end of the day, he goes, I want you to make my foresters think like a tree. He goes, I'm spending millions of dollars to do silvicultural practices out there. And more than once, one of these things has gone sideways, and I brought that forester in and asked him what happened. And he goes, I don't know. I think it's this, but I'm not sure. Now, I can't say the information I gave him all the answers, but at least what it did is it opened up the eyes of the foresters so they can make better decisions and think about that tree when they made their silvicultural practices decisions.